Hey, what's up? It's Jake. We're here to start off our conversation on Terraform modules. So in order to get started with this, you're going to have an environment set up. So the first thing I would do is recommend I just made this up and running to directory, and in that I created a global, a prod, and a stage. And then right now I'm just working in stage. So I've got a MySQL directory, a network, and a web server cluster. So I deviated from the Terraform example and the up and running example just because I think this is a little cleaner way to do it. But what I did was in global, I made a DynamoDB directory and I just made 3 DynamoDB tables, one for web, MySQL, and network, and then created those. And then I have an S3 bucket I'm using for my backend state files. And then for my SQL, I went ahead and set up a remote backend on S3 and DynamoDB, and then just created a simple database, plain text username and password, and then that's it. So this has remote state management. It's all pretty simple here. However, for the network, there's a there's a lot more stuff going on. So I've got my S3 remote backend configuration, and then I've got my VPC, Internet Gateway, route tables, route table association, subnets, security group, and a load balancer. I built this so that I could iterate against my web server cluster without having to mess with any of these targets. But I did do some interesting things with references. So I did use Terraform Remote State as a data source. And you can see here I did a lot of internal references like referring to a security group that I just created and things like that. And that's all fine and well. What I did was I output the values of my VPC ID, my load balancer, subnet, BNC, and my security group. And the reason I did that is for my web server. So I actually created a data file and said, and you've seen me use this pattern for the AMI before, but hey, remote state, grab this network reference and just give me the backend state file from S3 for network. And if you look at my network output, all this stuff is just um, what I'm grabbing from what I'm calling network. So in my data here, you can name this whatever you want, but I just said, hey, on the backend S3, go grab this state file. So this is my networking state file that is being generated from the Terraform apply of this whole template. So since I've declared this as a data source in my main file, what I did was I again created a separate remote backend. So all three of these have separate remote backend, separate state, separate locks, separate DynamoDB tables, etc. But you'll see like I need a VPC ID for my load balancer target group. So what I did was instead of using a reference like I did before, I just said data dot Terraform remote state dot, and then network is the name of my data source that you saw, and then dot outputs, and then anything in my outputs file is now fair game. So I have a Nimbus DevOps VPC ID. So I'm passing the VPC ID from this other state file to here. So I did this for my load balancer ARN. I did it for my image ID. I did it for my subnet ID, my security group, and my VPC zone identifiers for subnets B and C. So that's pretty much the gist of this. If you go look at my repo, I'll put a link to my Git repo. You can get all the code. But it takes a little while to set up. The strategy I did was kind of what I would anticipate a monolith doing, which is pretend this stage folder is just like your entire environment wherever you work. The way that I did it was I initialized my Terraform for MySQL network and web server cluster locally. I just ran a Terraform in it. And then once it had been initialized, and I had my S3 bucket and I have my DynamoDB tables, I did a Terraform init. And then what I did was I just did a migrate state, and I migrated the state from local to S3, and I got all the lock files moved over to DynamoDB, and I got all my state files moved over to S3, and that's all set up. So you should have something like this. And the idea behind a module is, because like it took me a while to get this all set up, which is fine, but you need at least two environments, right? You need something and you need prod. And what I don't want to do is have to go through and copy everything in stage and paste it into prod and then go through and update all the values and make sure I didn't make any mistakes. Stage is probably going to be smaller because you're going to want to save money and not run your full production infrastructure. For example, you probably don't need load balance against an auto-scaling group with as many instances. You may only need 2 and prod might need 12, stuff like that. Um, so without having to copy and paste all this, the best thing to do is create another directory like I did, and then and you could copy and paste it, but that's like I said, kind of a pain. But with Terraform, you can use something called the Terraform module. And what we're going to do is pretty much everything is a module, and you can just reuse them just like you would reuse a function in programming. So uh, it's a pretty big deal, but essentially what we're going to do is instead of having the same code copy and pasted everywhere, we're going to have both environments reuse my code. So I can take this stage code and I can make a new folder called modules. And then what I can do is I can move this stuff into modules. And then for stage, I can just say, hey, use the, module. And then it will just make everything that's included in that module. And in prod, I can say, hey, use the module. And it makes it very easy to reuse code for infrastructure, and it decreases the amount of code you have in your repo, which decreases the amount you have to manage, which decreases the likelihood for errors. It's just a lot easier. Once you start using them, you're just going to be using them all the time. So as we go through this module section, you're going to see a lot more use of variables, a lot more use of um, secrets, a lot more use of just code reuse in general. So we'll start by building everything in a module, create a library of modules to share. You can find modules online. You can start thinking of your entire infrastructure as basically just a module. So stuff we're going to go over is just kind of like basics of modules, inputs, locals, outputs, some weird stuff you might run into, and then module versioning as well. So that's it. So if you have any questions, let me know. But at this point, before you go any further, make sure you have this code. Or if you want a fun exercise, go create your own staging environment and make sure you have, you can either do a custom network or you can use a default VPC. Make sure you have a database and make sure you have a web server cluster. You don't really need to connect your web server to the database. That's not the intent of this, is to understand how all of that works and be really good at that. It's to understand how to recycle your code, reuse it in a modular fashion. So if you have any questions, let me know. But if not, get ready for some fun.